One reason that many people will acknowledge, the Gospels are ancient biographies, therefore we should expect them to be historical, but they sometimes object. The Gospels include stories of miracles. 1/3 of the Gospel of Mark includes miracle accounts, healings, nature miracles, casting out spirits, and about 1/5 of the book of Acts is comprised of that. And so they say, we know these things don't happen, and so obviously these are unreliable narrators, or they're depending on unreliable information. To that I would like to say, the idea that eyewitnesses never report these things is something that's demonstrably false. And I was aware of that myself because I knew people who claimed to be eyewitnesses of these things. I had witnessed some of these things myself. But I decided, just to help the people who are unfamiliar with these things, I would start documenting some of them and citing a footnote, and eventually the footnote grew. It ended up being 1,100 pages with my first book on the subject. There are hundreds of millions of claims around the world. There was a Pew Forum survey done, I believe it was 2006 or so, of just Pentecostals and Charismatics in 10 countries. And of the Pentecostals and Protestant Charismatics in these 10 countries alone, the estimated number of people who claim to have witnessed or experienced divine healing came out to somewhere around 200 million people. Now, if you don't like Pentecostals or Charismatics, you should really like everybody. But if you don't like them, the control group for the survey was other Christians, so those who weren't Pentecostal or Protestant Charismatics. And among them, overall in those 10 countries, it comes out to somewhere around 39% of them claim to have witnessed or experienced divine healing. So that's just 10 countries. We're talking about hundreds of millions of people claiming to have witnessed these things. China was not in one of the 10 countries surveyed. Yet around the year 2000, it was said from somebody within the China Christian Council, which is affiliated with the Three Self Church, that roughly half of all conversions to Christianity within the previous 2 decades were due to what they called faith healing experiences. The estimates from within the house church movement were often higher than that, sometimes as high as 90%, especially in rural areas. So we're talking, again, probably about millions of people there. And we're talking about people who didn't start with a Christian bias. That is, they didn't start with Christian presuppositions, but actually in many cases were willing to abandon centuries of ancestral tradition in certain areas to follow a new way. So this is not just, my headache went away after I'd had a headache for half an hour or something like that. These are cultures that had indigenous healing traditions, but they were so persuaded by something that took place that they were willing to risk a great social cost coming to follow Jesus. Many of my friends in India have recounted to me also how many have turned that way. In Nepal, Dr. Balkrishna Sharma shared with me that 80% of Christians in Nepal who convert from non-Christian backgrounds, it's because of healing or deliverance. So this is something that's widely attested by eyewitnesses around the world. You can explain these occasions however you want, but it's really defying empirical evidence to say nobody who's an eyewitness claims these things. Now, in terms of how we explain it, that's going to depend largely on your philosophic presuppositions. But in many cases, we have medical documentation. So in terms of claims of miracles, nobody's going to say that every claim that everybody makes is actually a miracle. And certainly nobody's going to argue that it can only be explained that way. But we actually have many cases with medical documentation. We have some cases like that, even for people being raised from the dead, for blind eyes being opened, for deaf ears being opened. One case that was published in a recent medical journal was of a woman. She'd been blind for 12 years due to verified organic causes, and her husband who was they were from a church that didn't really talk about miracles for today, but just in desperation one night as they were doing their devotions together, he cried out, "God, please heal my wife's eyes." And suddenly she could see. And it's verified medically, both before and after, sufficient evidentially that it was published in a medical journal. It was the first time she could see her children's faces. And we have many other cases published in medical journals or where we have the medical documentation. I won't go into all of those, but just to mention that there are many of them. Sometimes the medical documentation is in journals. Sometimes it's available online. There's a doctor who came back to life after an hour and a half of people trying to resuscitate him, when his wife, who's also a doctor, just cried out to God. His heart suddenly started beating. All his systems had shut down, but he's back to work now, and he has the medical records available online. So we do have accounts of these things happening today. And as far as spirits being cast out and people saying, well, that couldn't really happen. Even David Friedrich Strauss, who was one of the leading voices in the denial of miracles in the 1800s, didn't deny that people experienced what they thought was spirit possession. Anthropologists have documented spirit possession in a majority of the world's cultures. Now, not all the anthropologists themselves believe these are actual spirits, but they document experiences that look just like those in the New Testament, that are indigenously interpreted in a majority of the world's cultures as spirit possession. So there's no reason to look at the Gospels and say, well, these things can't be historical, because we have, in fact, plenty of evidence to say people do experience things like this. And therefore, there's no reason to doubt that people a long time ago could have experienced these things as well.